Good evening from Vietnam. I'm Jim Baldridge. I'm standing in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City, better known as Saigon. Saigon was the emotional heart of the Vietnam War. Now, Saigon is rapidly becoming a boomtown. News Center 7's Don Mills and I traveled to Vietnam to find out for you and the Miami Valley's veterans what this country is all about in 1994. This is a return trip for Don Mills. Don was 20 when he came to fight for his country. Don will share his story and his emotions as he enters Vietnam as a journalist and relives his experience as a Marine. In this special report, Back to Vietnam, you'll hear a first-hand account of torture from Beaver Creek resident Ed Meckenbauer, who shares his story of being held prisoner by the Vietnamese. We'll take you on a dig in search of American soldiers still missing. Plus, we'll explain what the U.S. plans to gain by opening trade relations with a country we once knew only as the enemy. Some Ohio businesses are already cashing in on the Vietnam market. These stories and much more in this News Center 7 special report, Back to Vietnam.
A decade of bloodshed, forgiven by some, not forgotten by many. A war that divided our country in the 60s and still affects us today. News Center 7's Jim Baldridge and Don Mills take you on an incredible journey back to Vietnam. The country, the people, the change.
To a foreigner, it looks like bedlam. Bicycles, baskets, and motorbikes cram the streets of Vietnam. The Vietnamese are busy people. Their day starts early and is full of routine. Rice farmers work 7 days a week from sun up to sundown. The Viet people are thought to have come from southern China. Today, they share many ancient religious and cultural traits with their cousins across the border in China's Guangdong province. Until French colonial rule in the mid-1800s, the Vietnamese wrote their language with a Chinese alphabet. Now they use a Roman alphabet like the French and the English, but the language itself is still very similar to Cantonese. Like most Asians, the Vietnamese are deeply spiritual people who have not lost touch with their religious roots. Buddhism is the predominant faith. The country is a curious mix of old and new, especially in big cities like Hanoi and Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. Times are changing for these people. Vietnam is finally opening its doors to the outside world once again. With private enterprise, hundreds of small businesses, from restaurants to corner cigarette vendors, are springing up. Agriculture remains the nation's largest employer. The largest crop is rice, which is grown for both domestic consumption and international trade. Land is the property of the state, but each family is leased land in certain amounts depending on their needs. For such hard work, pay is minimal. The people make an equivalent of about $250 US in a year's work. Vietnam is one of the world's poorest countries. Dress is a potpourri of styles. Fair skin is believed beautiful, so women take precautions against the sun. Even though straw hats and gloves are common, American-style dress is now a trend in Vietnam. For America, the Vietnam War began in controversy in 1964 and ended a decade later in a humiliating defeat. Through it all, America agonized over sending young men and some young women to fight half a world away. Although small numbers of U.S. advisors had been in Vietnam for years, the buildup of combat forces began under President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. By 1968, more than 500,000 Americans were fighting communism and a civil war in South Vietnam. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army launched a massive series of attacks named after the Vietnamese New Year, Tet. They suffered very heavy losses, but the attack was a turning point in American support for the war. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, promising he had a secret plan to end the war. But Americans continued to die until 1973, when President Nixon announced a phased pullout of American ground forces. Only a few military advisors were on hand by 1975, when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army stormed Saigon. By the time the Vietnam War was over, nearly 60,000 Americans had lost their lives. We suffered 210,000 casualties and spent billions and billions of dollars. After all of that, this was America's exit. A helicopter fights its way into the air from atop the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. South Vietnamese citizens we'd promised to protect try to cling to the chopper's skids. That is the helipad, and this is the American Embassy today. It's now the headquarters of Petro Vietnam, the state-owned oil company. Ironically, an American-owned firm has just leased office space here. Still, most of the old embassy is empty, and its grounds are a spooky place. An American confronts ghosts here. Ghosts of the teenage friends who never came home. Ghosts of the childish faith that America could never lose a war. Somehow there's a sense of dread in this place, and guilt. Guilt for fighting, guilt for not fighting, guilt for those who had it worse than you. Listen to these chilling words from a new monument on the wall of the old embassy.
Here is the former U.S. Embassy during the U.S. aggression against Vietnam. Monkey year 1968 at 2 hours 15 minutes a.m. of January 31st. 17 Special Task Force of the Liberation Army of Saigon-Jaring region attacked and seized this building for a few hours.
I always considered myself well-adjusted about this war, and it just, the memorial out front of talking about U.S. aggression and against the Vietnamese people is just it's difficult to hear those words read and be an American veteran.
Did you ever think when you were here that what you were committing was aggression? No, against the Vietnamese people.
No, I did what I was told by my government, and that was the bottom line.
Not far from the old embassy, more images from America's painful past in Vietnam. The old presidential palace of South Vietnam. A Soviet-built tank crashing through those gates on April 30th, 1975, symbolized the fall of the South. Today, this is a popular tourist attraction. Its new name, Reunification Hall. This is the Bin Soup Shop, said to have been a popular dining place for American GIs during the war. It was also the headquarters for the Saigon Viet Cong during the war. The order to begin the Tet Offensive was given on the second floor, just above this soup shop. You can still buy a bowl of soup at number 9 Lai Chin Tong Street, even though the Bin Soup Shop is a National Historic Site and its owner is a national hero. Nyo Tong Bin is in his 80s now, a spry and sparkly old man used to greeting visitors. He enjoys sharing memories of his Viet Cong days when he served soup to Americans while plotting against them.
The first of the Lunar New Year, after delivering the order, we attacked in every field, every place. For example, the U.S. Embassy, the military, the police station, and the Navy bases, and everywhere.
American blood flowed in the streets of Saigon. It was January 1968. The Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the communists, but it was a public relations victory.
Bring home! Bring our brothers home!
American support for the war began eroding quickly. Only hours into the fighting, Bin was captured and hauled off to a notorious island prison.
I was arrested on the first day of the Lunar New Year in 1968, and after delivering the order, and I was put into prison, and I was given a life imprisonment. He was beaten badly, not by American soldier, but by the Vietnamese soldier of the South government.
Bin says he never hated Americans. The Viet Cong, he says, were forced to fight those who helped an evil government stay in power. He's proud that he and his soup shop served his country. Bin believes the American people were on his side.
The war became an issue of history, and we put the war behind us. And the fact that the American people also support our struggle against the American aggression.
Then Mr. Bin asked me to sign his memory book. I thought of friends I'd lost half a lifetime ago and struggled with my emotions. The best I could manage was, "Thanks for helping us better understand the war." Because of my emotions, I could not accept a bowl of his famous soup.
The soup shop isn't the only painful reminder of the war, which remains in 1994. Other sites around Vietnam are still haunting, 2 decades after our fighting here was done.
These are the jungles of Vietnam. What you don't see is below me, 80 miles of a tunnel system. It was used during the war. In fact, it was a stronghold for the Viet Cong.
The area around the Cu Chi tunnels was deadly during the war. Thousands of VC lived here. In fact, a VC general had his headquarters here. History teaches a major part of the 68 Tet Offensive was launched from the Cu Chi tunnels.
I can tell you about this side, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom, the teaching of Ho Chi Minh.
Today it's memorialized as a tourist attraction, $3 admission, and according to the Vietnamese, more than 100,000 people visited here last year, including 300 Americans. For me, this was a sobering place to visit, and one which made me feel very uncomfortable. This is the way it was during the war. American servicemen sent into the tunnels in search of Viet Cong. It was a deadly business. To see these tunnels today, complete with bamboo booby traps still intact, is hard to look at, even in 1994. Foreign tourists are shown the tunnels, 3 levels of them in all. Everything from the VC General's headquarters to operating rooms for wounded soldiers. And there's a steady conversation about the war from the Vietnamese point of view.
We call it's a fighting tunnel. The soldiers down there can come up and for the fighting, and then going back here to leave down.
Okay, so soldiers lived in here.
Yeah.
Okay. As you might expect, the Cu Chi tunnels were a major target of American aircraft during the war. The Vietnamese say these are bomb craters left by American planes. They're clearly marked for tourists to see.
Bombs were dropped right here, right here.
The Cu Chi Tunnel complex is a clear reminder of the war in Vietnam. It brings back painful memories for every American, but there are others as well. This, for example, is what the Vietnamese government calls a war crimes museum. It's filled with American weaponry and gruesome pictures from the war. And so while the face of Vietnam has changed in 1994, there are still plenty of reminders of what happened here nearly 2 decades ago, a time in a war which claimed the lives of more than 58,000 Americans.
This is the Vietnam most American GIs knew, a land of rice paddies and thick tropical jungle and overwhelming tropical heat.
And those are the sites which still look the same today. A sea of rice fields filled with Vietnamese workers. These are the fields just outside Da Nang. It's an area I was very familiar with more than 20 years ago.
The last time I was here was in 1969 with the U.S. Marine Corps. I'd expected to drive into town and find exactly where I was stationed before, but it's not that easy. It was on one of these hills near Da Nang Airport, Hill 327. But in 1994, it's difficult to find. The face of Vietnam is changing.
This is the way it looked back in 1969. This is Hill 327 overlooking Da Nang. It's changed in 1994, the remnants of war nearly gone. The revetments at Da Nang Airport, which housed U.S. planes during the war, are still there, but they now house Russian MiGs. Hoi An, near Da Nang, was another stop I made during the war. This is how it looked back then. This is Hoi An today. The only thing I recognized was the ever-present white sand. And I was not alone. Other vets I talked with in Vietnam had trouble finding the places they had fought the war as well.
Other than crossroads and grids that we knew we were there where we were at, but other than that, everything's been changed.
Again, most of the visible signs of war are gone near Da Nang, but that's not the case everywhere in Vietnam.
This prison in the heart of Hanoi, built by the French colonialists, was used to imprison American pilots shot down in the Hanoi area. The Americans came to call it the Hanoi Hilton. One of those Americans, a young man by the name of Ed Meckenbauer. The life of Air Force fighter pilot Ed Meckenbauer changed drastically on June 14, 1967.
And I said, bail out, Kevin, bail out. And I'd always told him if he heard the second bailout, he was going to be second. And he paused long enough to say, sayonara, Ed, and that's why we came out together, side by side. And airplane tumbled over 6 times, and on the 6th time, ejected and got out.
The Vietnamese shot down Ed's F-4 Phantom fighter near Hanoi. For the next 6 years, he was a prisoner of war. It all happened very fast.
The only reason I even thought to get out of the airplane is my backseater said, Ed, I don't think we're going to make it. Because I was still trying to fly this airplane, which was really just on a ballistic path at that point. But it all happens very fast, and then you're in your parachute on the ground, the adrenaline rush, they got you, they're cutting every stitch of clothes off you with machetes, dragging you around.
What Ed was about to endure, you and I will never know. More than once, he tasted death.
They put us back up against these two slits in the ground and says, now you die. And they got the firing squad out in front of us, and they go, Mot high. And they move some of the crowd back. Now you die. Mot high, with the guys pulling the guns up. We take more pictures first, you know, Mot high. Well, the third time, you get kind of cocky about it. You know, they're not going to do anything, and you relax.
Ed says there was no rational explanation for the torture. The North Vietnamese wanted to control his mind.
To figure that if they had control of your body, then they would have control of your mind. And that's the way they thought.
Getting control of Ed's mind was hard. He was prepared for interrogation and fell back on his training. It was rough, but he hesitates to call it torture.
You know, a lot of it medieval, you know, thumb screws and pulling fingernails and burning with cigarettes.
Ed has no bitterness toward the Vietnamese. He said it was their job, and they were just following direction.
Even the fellow who came in and beat the heck out of me was reacting to direction. I mean, he had no personal hatred towards me. I mean, I don't think he thought that I bombed his house or killed his family.
For part of his captivity, Ed was held at the turn-of-the-century Hoa Lo prison, built by the French. The Americans called it the Hanoi Hilton. The Vietnamese called it the Oven.
I did. I lived for 18 months in a room that was 10 by 10 with no windows, 2 small air vents. And I spent a week with my feet manacled in the footlocks and my hands behind my back, which turned out to be the cause of some of the most serious physical problems I had when I got into my spinal cord pretty good with the wrist locks.
Thinking back, Ed remembers how he passed the time.
You'd be surprised at what people do to entertain themselves and others. We had contests where you think of every brand of beer that you can think of, and you compile these lists, and you go through them in your mind day after day. And of course, whenever there was somebody whose name you got to list, we all kept a running list of all the names, real or thought to be real, of everybody who was in all the camps. I was a German teacher, and at various times living with guys who spoke other languages. I took Russian, French, and Spanish. I took math classes. We had a fellow up there who memorized Richard III and spoke that. We had guys who were just great trivia freaks, and so you just memorize all sorts of useless stuff, a good bit of which was later found to be absolutely false. But then again, you're not getting any outside information. You get tired of saying, I don't know, when somebody asks you a question.
Captain Ed Meckenbauer was in the second group of American prisoners of war to be freed. For Ed, the nightmare came to an end in early 1973. After all this, Ed has no bitterness. He even adopted a Vietnamese baby. Later in this program, we show Ed what we saw in Vietnam, and you'll hear his reaction.
Ed Meckenbauer came home. Many soldiers did not. The United States is searching for them right now in Vietnam. The missing and the dead. That story when we return.
More than 2,000 Americans are still listed as missing in action in Southeast Asia. In 1994, accounting for all the MIAs is a top priority of the U.S. government. For families who have been waiting a quarter century or more, that top priority status is too little, too late.
It was not my job to bring my husband home. It was not my friend's job to bring their son home. It was the government's job, and I didn't see them doing it.
They are the words of a woman who has endured what most of us can't even imagine. This was Betty Foley and her family just a month before her husband came up missing in Southeast Asia. Major Brendan Foley, an Air Force pilot, he was declared missing after a mission to Vietnam, Thanksgiving night, 1967.
An Air Force chaplain and an officer came to the door the day after Thanksgiving and told me that he was missing. And my initial relief was, gee, I hope they find him soon, because from the very beginning I believed him to be alive, expected him to come home, expected them to pick him up at any time, you know, in the jungle somewhere. That did not occur.
5 children left alone with only a mother to raise them. The children and a lot of other people think she's done a pretty good job. Betty holds the honor of Dayton's Mother of the Year award. She was honored just weeks ago. Betty proudly talks about her family, those 5 kids and now 3 grandchildren. She remembers the 70s, being active with a League of Families, demanding answers from the government about her husband and the other MIAs. But the answers didn't come, and in the 80s, she came to a painful conclusion.
He is dead. He is not returning, and I am a widow.
It is the horrible reality of this war a quarter century ago. Millions of young Americans went off to battle in Southeast Asia. Some have never come home. Officially, 2,234 Americans are unaccounted for. In Vietnam, 1,643, 505 in Laos, 78 in Cambodia, and 8 in the People's Republic of China. And in 1994, full accountability is a top priority.
In Hanoi, Vietnam, an MIA office investigates every lead or clue on missing Americans from the Vietnam War.
They call this place the Ranch, 22 American military stationed here, the only military assigned in Vietnam in 1994. And their mission is clear, full accountability of every MIA case.
At any one time, we have as many as 14 teams that operate in the country, investigating cases, checking museums out, the archives, looking for documents, looking for clues, looking for crash sites, working in very remote areas of the country, trying to find the answers of what happened many years ago during the war.
And this is that effort. These historical photos detail the humanitarian mission. It's painstaking work combing through every mile of jungle, sifting through every particle of earth, looking for any kind of clue. The men who do this job are volunteers. They realize the importance of their work to try to bring their fallen comrades home.
Work's very rewarding.
Jeff Newman is from Cincinnati, Ohio. He's a Vietnamese linguist in the U.S. Navy. It's Jeff's 4th trip to Vietnam to work on the MIA issue. Jeff says it's emotional work, but terribly rewarding.
One case that I investigated, I just found out a couple of days ago that it was positively identified. You know that that's, one U.S. service member that's gone home, and it's a great feeling.
This is not an easy tour of duty. Dig sites are in remote areas of the jungle. Sometimes they're on the face of mountains where U.S. planes were reported to have crashed during the war. Members of the MIA team have come down with malaria, been bitten by snakes, and taken falls from those mountains. But they continue, spurred on by more than 100 live sighting reports in 1992. People who said they saw American MIAs in Southeast Asia. But so far, no Americans have been found alive.
The evidence we have so far says that an American was not held after the war. We're continuing to work that issue very hard. We have special investigators that work that issue. Again, I can't predict the future, but we're looking.
Betty Foley is continuing to look as well, today looking through a scrapbook, remembering the good times nearly 30 years ago. She and husband Bren raising their family before he had to go fight a war from which he didn't return. And even though Betty has come to terms with the fact that her husband is dead, the questions still remain for her and other MIA families. To get the answers, she says, the recovery and the return of her husband's remains would be the greatest gift she and her family could now receive.
It would mean that once and for all, I would be able to say, I know, Bren, what happened to you. I know you didn't want it to happen, but it did anyway. And I'm sorry you're gone.
At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, parents and children, brothers and sisters, widows and friends find solace in touching a name on this wall, seeing that there is something of their loved one left in this world. Dayton and many other communities across the nation have erected their own Vietnam memorials. Here, a granite ring contains the names of 412 men and women from the Miami Valley who died in that war, now a generation ago.
When Back to Vietnam continues, then and now, Not only times have changed, but landscape has too. See how Vietnam is entering the modern world. Plus meet a group reuniting in Vietnam for the first time in more than 20 years. It's a reunion you won't want to miss.
As you walk the streets of Saigon in 1994, you're seeing more and more Americans. Here at the Hotel Caravel, which was said to be a favorite for American GIs during the war, right now there's a very special reunion going on.
They are smiling today, but 25 years ago, these men were anything but happy. There are no war stories here tonight, just memories, despite the smiles, painful memories. This was their Vietnam 2 decades ago. Flying across the jungles, fighting the enemy from the air, picking up the wounded from the battlefield. These men are soldiers, the men who fought the war. They raise their flag proudly here in Saigon, the Air Cavalry Division, a decorated unit from the Vietnam War. They have made the trip back to Vietnam as a group, veterans comforting other vets, vets trying to heal.
It's difficult seeing these guys, guys that were over here and stuff. It brings it back in a way. The realization of it. A lot's gone on. It's been over 25 years.
Every member of the group had a different reason to come back to Vietnam. For some it was memories, for some healing, for some a time to try to put the war behind them. Colonel Richard Speedman spent 13 months in Vietnam, flying a helicopter in 1967 and 68. For him, this was a tough trip back.
When we visited some of the areas, I went to Camp Evans and I walked out looking for where the helicopters were dug in and the big Chinooks were put in the ground and everything to protect them, and finally realized I was staying on the spot. And staying there and thinking about looking at the casualty lists and, at night when the Sergeant Major bring it in and everything, it brought a lot of those memories back, and they hurt. Yeah, they hurt.
Colonel Speedman says scenes like this are what he remembers most about Vietnam. Flying a chopper across the treetops, fighting a war from the air. But today the country looks different. Few reminders of the war are still visible. Those we called enemy during the war are still here, like the former VC officer who took Colonel Speedman to the airport in Hanoi during this trip back.
We got to the airport and then he pulled his sandals out that he wore, and he told me these are the last sandals he had as a VC in the war, and he wanted me to have them. And then he grabbed me and kissed me on both cheeks, and he started to cry.
Colonel Speedman says shedding a few tears is just part of the trip back to Vietnam, remembering scenes like this, remembering those who died, those wounded, those who didn't come home. Powerful memories for men who fought a war 2 decades ago, men still trying to heal in 1994.
But it's very difficult to describe. The realization that it's over. I'd come back to Vietnam again, I think. I'd recommend it for anyone who wants to.
I've accepted the fact that these people were fighting for a cause. There's some things that I can't forget. I can forgive, I can't forget.
The communist winners of the Vietnam War named Saigon Ho Chi Minh City in honor of their late leader. The people who live here still call it Saigon. And it's starting to look a lot like the old Saigon before the communists took over. Once again, the city's hundreds of now legal small businesses prefer taking U.S. dollars instead of Vietnamese dong, which trade officially at 10,800 dong to the dollar. Saigon is booming. American firms are rushing back, and a longtime American law firm has returned to help them. Sesto Vecchi worked as an attorney in Vietnam from 1967 until the communists took over in 1975. He returned to Saigon last year and opened an office in Hanoi last month.
Vietnam has simply got to develop because of where it is. It's a big country. It's 70 million people. The consumer market may not be that great today, but it's not that bad.
The catalyst for this business boom, says Vecchi, was the lifting of the U.S. trade embargo.
So that the boom you see is not just from American companies. There have been any number of companies that I think were waiting for the embargo to be lifted. It gives them more confidence.
Companies like Citibank are renting office space in Saigon. Emery Air Freight recently opened an office here. Coke and Pepsi are invading. Dozens of Ohio companies are looking at Vietnam, and Ohio's Southeast Asian Trade Representative, Alice Mong, is ready to help them.
It is going to be a growing economy, no doubt in my mind, with 70+ million people. I think 70 or 80% of them under the age of 40. There's a big consumer market potential there. The infrastructural project is also an area that Ohio companies can benefit from.
But Mong urges Ohio companies to do their homework before jumping in. And Attorney Vecchi says Vietnam can be a confusing place for Americans.
I think if you get used to the idea that, generally speaking, you can do things only if it's permitted, rather than you can do things if it's not prohibited, that you can get by very easily.
But inevitably, more Americans will come here. In the capital, Hanoi, office complexes and new hotels are going up. U.S. State Department officials are on a not-so-secret scouting mission, looking for a place to put a U.S. consular office. It could open this year. Full diplomatic relations could be only a year or two away. Vietnam wants us back. We may have lost the war, but we seem to be winning the peace. The beautiful countryside of Vietnam has survived a lot. Thousands of years of intensive rice farming, hundreds of years of civil wars, a decade of American bombing. Now, can it survive American developers?
You've heard of this place before. This is China Beach, immortalized in a popular television series. This is where American GIs did what was called in-country R&R during the Vietnam War. If you were one of those GIs, listen to this. Vietnam wants you back. To get you and other American tourists to bring money to places like China Beach, the Vietnamese government is calling upon American developers like L. DeMatteis.
I am confident. I am confident. Yes, I am confident. And I think I got here at the right time.
DeMatteis is a deal doer. He's built major projects all over the world by bringing American capital and expertise together with cheap local labor.
In some cases, $20 a month. In some cases, for a good artisan, maybe $200 a month.
At China Beach, so many American companies want to build that DeMatteis has had to help organize them.
Why don't you build a golf course, I'll build a hotel, you build something else, and, you know, everybody pool their thoughts together.
But this is going to be one heck of a big tourist
area. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They're talking about direct flights coming in from Bangkok, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, directly into Da Nang.
DeMatteis is talking about $140 million or more worth of development along China Beach. Hotels, golf courses, tennis clubs, rooms at 5-star standards, drinkable tap water, dependable electricity and air conditioning. Things you won't find now.
The most difficult thing right now is that the infrastructure is in no way ready to handle the influx of tourists.
Rose Earhart works in Hanoi for Gannon Tours, one of the first U.S. companies to specialize in bringing Americans here. She won't kid you about the current accommodations.
You have to expect the unexpected. You have to be prepared for inconveniences. It's not a necessarily comfortable place to go. If you're looking for the Hyatt and a nice, quiet place on the beach, maybe that's not what you're going to find.
Even without Americans, tourism in Vietnam has been increasing by 20 to 30% a year. This group from France includes several veterans of the French military in Vietnam.
I am very afraid that there will be too many people and it will spoil the land.
There's already one small resort at China Beach, and the port of Da Nang, a few miles away, has become a stop for cruise ships. Now that the U.S. trade embargo is over, the port of Da Nang is expecting its business to take off.
Many USA delegations came to the Da Nang port to study. So I hope in the near future they will invest or make joint venture in Da Nang, especially at Da Nang port.
Already, Da Nang port is building new container ship facilities. Hotels are under construction in town. And Al DeMatteis is wheeling and dealing on China Beach.
American, BBI American.
In a few years, going back to Vietnam will be a lot easier, and parts of it will look a lot like Miami Beach.
The face of Americans in the bodies of Vietnamese. Abandoned Amerasians, crying for their fathers, hoping to become Americans, for themselves and their children. The Amerasian generation, when we return.
They are the forgotten victims of the Vietnam War, Amerasian children fathered by American servicemen. How do they feel about the war that left them behind?
These are the children born from that war. Many are now in their mid-20s, and they are known as Amerasians. There are no firm estimates on just how many Amerasians there are in Southeast Asia. They come to this center just outside Saigon to start the process of trying to find their fathers they believe are Americans. When American reporters show up here, the people flock with pictures, questions, and hope. The center was established back in 1982 and is run by the Vietnamese government. Nguyen Tam has been at the center since May of 1990. She is now 26 years old. Since birth, she has been an orphan.
Right after I was born, my father gave me to another woman, and she raised me up. And I do not have any information about my mother and also my father.
The fact is, very few of those at this center will find their natural fathers. There's hardly any information to go on for most. Nguyen Tam hopes she's an exception.
I need to find my father because up to now I do not have father and mother, and I lack of the heart feelings within the family.
The population is continuing to grow at the Amerasian Center. Right now, there are nearly 200 families here, children born during the war, some who now have their own children. 25-year-old Nguyen Zung is very emotional about finding her father, and she says she has a message for him.
I would say to my father that please help me and my daughter to go to the States.
Going to the States is the goal for all of those in the Amerasian Center, and the people who run this government operation say the reason is simple.
They think that the States is a paradise.
Paradise or not, the fact is most of these people will not get to the States, and their plight may soon get worse. The Amerasian Center is scheduled to close by the end of this year.
Still to come, you met Ed Meckenbauer earlier in this show. Now we'll tell you what this POW thinks of Vietnam today. A prisoner who wants no pity when we come back.
Well, I was 24 years old then, 2 weeks short of my 25th birthday. Not exactly the way I expected to spend my 25th birthday.
But this is how Ed Meckenbauer celebrated that birthday and 6 more as an American prisoner of war here at the Hanoi Hilton and at several other prisons in North Vietnam. Ed was a lieutenant then. Now he's a colonel in the Air Force Reserve and a business executive in civilian life. Ed was not able to go with us back to Vietnam, so we shared our experiences with him by videotape. This is the Da Nang Air Base where Ed's last flight began. These old fortified hangars now house a few old Russian-built MiGs. And this is China Beach.
That's where I ran my water survival school.
And the Hanoi Hilton, where Ed Meckenbauer spent nightmare years.
That portal right there is the main entrance into the Wallow prison, Hanoi Hilton, and that's the one we went into about 4 o'clock in the morning, all tied up, and that's the one we came out of when it came time to be released in 1973.
You walked right through those doors?
Right through those doors, yeah.
What did you think? What were you thinking when you walked through those doors on your way?
I was scared to death when I was going into those doors. I mean, I was tired. I'd been up for a long time, and I'd had a lot of physical abuse on me, and I knew that this, this was going into something bad. I mean, no matter what my emotional state might have been, I knew it was going to be bad in there. This is one of those things where you hear stories about before you ever go there, and it's worse than you can ever imagine. That was one of the things about POW. The light never, ever, ever went off except during air raids. We had an escape committee, and we did have people who got over the fence, but nobody ever got more than a few blocks away from the prison, and nobody was ever outside the prison for more than about 24 hours.
What happened to the people who did make it over the fence?
When they were captured, the Vietnamese, without exception, tortured them, always ended up basically torturing one of them to death. The other one knew about it, and then putting the other guy back in the communication loop, even though we were all isolated and not together, putting them back in so that the word got out that
The tap
code, yep, that you know, they had killed Ed Atterbury, or they had killed so-and-so as a result of the escape attempt. And the other guy came back pretty well beaten up too, so you had a good visible reminder of the consequences.
Despite the pain and suffering, Ed Meckenbauer thinks it's time we normalized relations with Vietnam. He holds no grudges.
Oh, heavens no. I mean, not even the guards who tortured us. I mean, they were doing their job. I mean, as I was doing mine, and I hope they would recognize that.
Ed dropped bombs on people. They caught him. He doesn't seek their sympathy or yours. It is all a quarter century behind us. The future is what's ahead.
Norm and Hoy Hoover speak of their memories over candlelight and dinner. A love story that has endured war and worse. Stay with us. Back to Vietnam continues after this message.
The U.S. received its first shipment of rice from Vietnam just last month. 16,000 tons of rice was exported from a port in Ho Chi Minh City. The shipment is part of a contract to export 90,000 tons of Vietnamese rice to the United States. Vietnam is the world's largest rice exporter. Last year, the country produced 22 million tons of rice. Vietnam is selling, and Vietnam is buying. The country held its first ever American Trade Exposition in Hanoi last month, and already there are plans for another Viet America Expo in Saigon this fall. Inspired by the lifting of the U.S. trade embargo, this trade fair drew about 60 American companies. Dozens of others, like General Motors, wanted to be here, but couldn't get products and exhibits here in time. The old-line communist leaders of Vietnam are either compromising with capitalism or giving up. The new American invasion is on. Like it or not, Americans seem destined to have some kind of relationship with Vietnam. For Norman and Hoy Hoover, that relationship is very personal. They met here in Saigon 32 and a half years ago, right here at the once famous Continental Hotel.
I met my wife here in this hotel in 1961 on September 5th at 4 o'clock.
Norm Hoover is a romantic and a heck of a doctor. He was a busy young orthopedic surgeon back in 1962, taking time off from the Mayo Clinic to do months of volunteer work in Saigon.
Norman is very dedicated person, physician, to help the underdeveloping countries, or you can call it developing countries, and especially Vietnam. He spent most of his life, many years here. In 1970.
Hard to believe it's been a third of a century for them. Hoy, who had fled the communist north with her family, was studying to become a physical therapist. They met here at the Continental and fell in love. They worked together at a hospital. They got married, and they took up residence in the United States, but they kept returning to Vietnam for months and years at a time to share their gifts of healing, even during the war.
It was a very frightening time for me, because that was a time when rockets landed in Saigon from time to time.
Their last visit was in 1974. Saigon fell the next year. For 20 years, they would stay away. The war pains the Hoovers. They didn't take sides then, and they don't now, but...
We should either not have fought it or we should have fought it.
In other words, we didn't fight to win. But maybe we didn't lose after all. Maybe all those lives and all that money did not go for nothing.
We don't know what would have happened to Eurasian communism had there not been a confrontation of it. Certainly, it contributed to the decline of communist strength in the world.
That's a good thought for those of us who lost loved ones or our youth here in Vietnam. Another good thought. Rumor in Vietnam is that what's left of communism here will end this fall. America won almost every battle, but lost the war. Now, however, we seem to be winning the peace. So, the Hoovers will start coming back again. Next trip, they'll buy a home here. They're looking forward to more volunteer medical work here in Saigon, and to more candlelight dinners where they met 32 years ago, here at the Continental Hotel.
An interesting couple, perhaps symbolic of the old and the new Vietnam. This street corner in Hanoi is very symbolic of the new Vietnam. The country is modernizing at a breakneck pace. Capitalism has returned to the streets of Hanoi, officially encouraged by a government that is still technically communist. During the past hour, we've shown you exactly what we saw in Vietnam. We've tried to report to you very factually on some very emotional issues. Your thoughts, Don Mills?
Well, Jim, certainly a very emotional trip back to Vietnam for me. The last time I was here was in 1970 with the Marine Corps stationed near Da Nang. A couple of things struck me about this trip. First of all, the look of the country. It's entirely different now. It was very hard to find where I was in Da Nang. Secondly, the number of American visitors here, especially U.S. servicemen. I was surprised by that. We met a group down in Ho Chi Minh City of U.S. veterans. For them, this trip meant something different, as it did for each member of our new Center 7 crew.
Indeed. For Don Mills and the new Center 7 crew, I'm Jim Baldridge. Thanks for going with us back to Vietnam.